Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan, he, him, his pronouns. I'm an organizer with the Claudia Jones School for Political Education based in Washington, D.C. We are excited to host tonight's event with our friends from Black Women Radicals for this presentation and dialogue about Black communist, Black radical feminist, Black internationalist Claudia Jones. Our organization was recently founded earlier this year before the pandemic by longtime organizers in Washington, D.C., who are currently involved in many different movements, including Black liberation, Latin American solidarity, and the labor movement. Many of our organizers were also advocates in the fight to free Angela Davis in the early 1970s, and folks who organized with the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. We named our organization after Claudia because of her life's work in fighting for justice, contributions to Black radical feminism, and the worldwide revolutionary movement against capitalism and imperialism. Tonight, we will be joined by both Dr. Carole Boyce Davies and Jaimee Swift, the founder of Black Women Radicals. Nevertheless, before getting started, I would like to do a few housekeeping items. While we have other organizers in the background moderating the chat and the Q&A, I will be facilitating this event. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a tab for Q&A in the chat box in which you can insert comments and questions and engage with the dialogue. Please use the Q&A to ask questions, and we will try our best to engage as many questions as we can toward the end of this event. The event will also be recorded, so we can have it available for people who are not able to attend or current attendees who want it for future reference. It is also being live streamed on our YouTube channel for those who are not able to log into the Zoom webinar. With that being said, I will now introduce Carole Boyce Davies and Jaimee Swift. Carole Boyce Davies is a Caribbean American, radical intellectual, committed to social justice. Currently, Professor of Africana Studies and English at Cornell University. From the mid-1980s and throughout the mid-1990s, she was a popular award-winning professor at the State University of New York, Binghamton. In 1997, she was recruited to build the African Diaspora Studies program at Florida International University, where she served 3 successful terms until 2007, when she joined the Cornell faculty. An African diaspora scholar in writing and practice, she has recently been appointed to the prestigious Kwame Nkrumah Chair in African Studies at the University of Ghana region. Jaimee A. Swift, she, her, hers pronouns, is the founder, creator, and executive director of Black Women Radicals. She is a PhD candidate at Howard University with concentrations in Black politics.
It's you.
Sorry?
Howard.
We were saying HU.
We're bonding over the house.
No problem. All right, so her dissertation focuses on Black feminist politics and resistance against state, structural, and symbolic violence in Brazil. Having an affinity for truth-telling, her works focus on social justice, racial equity, and Black feminist thought and behavior in Africa and African diaspora. With all further ado, Dr. Carole Boyce Davies and Jaimee Swift.
Hi, what a joy. I am so proud. I keep saying I am ecstatic about this evening. I'm so proud of all of you and your generation of activists. You all are really taking it to the limit. I keep saying that I call you all finishers. Finishers because the generation that preceded you did a lot, but many of the activists got killed. We still have Black Panthers, political prisoners in prison. People were exiled. So, I mean, our generation suffered a lot of losses through all those assassinations and so on. So your generation, I'm proud of because you all took it to the limit. And as I was saying earlier, refused to accept any form of discrimination, any form. So, keep doing what you're doing. I was also pleased that there was an organization called the Claudia Jones School for Political Education. I want to compliment you on that naming. I say this because when I was a grad student at Howard, there used to be a Claudia Jones bookstore in the Adams Morgan area that you could go to and get Black left materials of various sorts. You could hang out there and so on. So it's interesting that there's a new organization formed by another group of activist organizers called the Claudia Jones School of Political Education. Claudia will be very happy to know this. And then, of course, another group called Black Women Radicals. So we're in good company by bringing together those two groups, right? So a lot of people are on this webinar. I saw Mashai. Mashai is in Kenya. She said it's 2 a.m. there. I'm really proud of you, Mashai. There are more people because he told other people to register. So actually we have people on this webinar from Africa, from the Caribbean, from Brazil, and of course, all across the United States. And I'm really, somebody said it's midnight in London. Oh my goodness. Judith, that's really lovely, Judith, that you're here. So what I thought, because of the topic, and I'm recognizing that there would be different levels of entry, different entry points for people to the subject. So I'll do a couple of combinations of things, maybe in 3 parts. So the first part generally talk about who Claudia Jones is for a general audience. And that will introduce those of you who haven't bought the books yet to do that. And then I'll go into a little bit more detail to talk about her as a radical Black female subject. And then I'm going to talk about her essay, The Right to Be Radical. Okay? So let's go. So who was Claudia Jones? I really am pleased to have this kind of encounter with her and you for another important reason. I was born in Trinidad and Tobago, which is where Claudia Jones is from. She was born in Trinidad and Tobago in 1915 and came to the United States when she was 8 years old and went through elementary and high schools in the United States. Her family moved to Harlem, which is, her father was a super in a building, and her mother worked in one of those startup factories in the city. So she comes from the Caribbean at 8 as part of that major wave of Caribbean migration that took place in that time period, and then enters school in the US, and therefore is raised from the time she's 8 all the way to the time that she's deported from the United States in Harlem and around the rest of the US where she did activist work. She joined the Young Communist League in 1936, and she is about 21 years old. But of course, you don't just join, right? Before that, she hung around with people. She was impressed by the analysis and the level of organizing they were doing on behalf of the Scottsboro Boys. Again, Scottsboro Boys is something, if you don't know, maybe make a note and just look at it, because they represent that earlier version of something that happened again to what would be called the Central Park Five, right? And therefore they became the Exonerated Five subsequently once people realized they had not done anything at all. So the boys were a group of young boys, 12 years old, who were tried, repeatedly accused of raping 2 white women in a boxcar. Not at all, of course. They tried them repeatedly, but the Communist Party was the party that really spearheaded the campaign to have them exonerated. Of course, many of them suffered ill effects from that incarceration and so on, but eventually it was to their benefit. So she listens to these discussions, having grown up in a working class family and seeing the kinds of difficulties that her parents experienced. And of course, it's in the middle of Jim Crow racism at that time, and also right on the edge of that really horrible period of economic devastation that people had called the Depression. So that conjunction of those two things rendered her, upon leaving high school, not with the skills or ability to be able to get the kind of employment she needed, worked in laundry, worked as a milliner, and did a number of things, but eventually joins the Communist Party, the Young Communist League, at 21 years old. So around 18, 19, 20, she's active, like many of you are, and then she becomes finally a member of that movement. So she joins in 1936, following Scottsboro Boys organizing. In the Communist Party, she becomes a journalist, and she's able then to develop her skills as a journalist, which then would carry forward, as we will see later on. But significantly for us, for our discussion, she is elected to the National Committee of the CPUSA in 1945, becoming the only person, only Black woman in that committee. So she is also, in 1948, a secretary of the Women's Commission of CPUSA, and along with Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, does a lot of traveling around the United States, organizing, doing the kinds of work that would bring in a number of women into the party. It's around this time that she writes two critically important essays. One, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman. That's the language they used then. And another one called We Seek Full Equality, which the first one is probably the one that most people see in anthologies, used repeatedly in discussions and so on, okay? So those two pieces really would be critical to that period. But along with that, she writes a column in the Daily Worker in the early 50s called Half the World, and really arguing ahead of people like the UN and the various declarations of women, that women represent half the world and therefore should receive half of the world's resources. She, in this period as well, is arrested 2 or 3 times, which is in the sort of heyday of the McCarthy period. And finally, she is arrested for a speech called International Women's Day and the Struggle for Peace. This is identified in the FBI files as the overt act which led to her arrest. She is tried with 12 other communists. There are 13 of them in the second group of communists who arrested. And the aim then, keep in mind, was to destroy the Communist Party. And there are 2 acts which are in place. The Smith Act, and the McCarran-Walter Act, which makes it a crime to espouse communistic ideas. And the argument was that this is meant to overthrow the United States government. So in other words, these were political prisoners who were tried for having ideas, not for doing anything that had to do with overthrowing the government. So she serves 10 months then of a sentence after she's tried, of a 1 year and a day sentence, but because of health issues is able to serve less time, is let out of prison, Alderson, West Virginia, that famous prison in Alderson, where Martha Stewart went. Also Billie Holiday was there. Several other people. I talk about this in the book, Left of Karl Marx, which I'll come to in a little bit. She serves 10 months there, is let out in October, and then she's been trying to appeal and be able to stay in the United States because she's sentenced to deportation. Now, the fact that she was born in Trinidad is critical here, and the fact that she became a communist that young is also, because essentially she is not able to ever get US citizenship, even though she applies for it, even though she was married to an American at one point. When she is deported then, her passport that she gets identifies her as a British subject. And if you look at the copy of the passport in the book Left of Karl Marx, you will see that this is the case, that she's identified as a British subject, which is interesting in itself, right? Because she's lived from the time she's 8 years old up until the time she's deported in the United States, and then she is not allowed to get citizenship. So she technically is still a British citizen or subject, which is what they would call then, and then sent to England at the end of 1955. And there's debate about that whole question. The idea from many people is that they did not want to send her back to Trinidad at that time because she would have been landing in Trinidad as a well-seasoned political organizer in the middle of a lot of other kinds of union activities. And some feel that England was the best place. I define it a little bit differently, but we can talk about that later if you'd like. She's deported to England, but she travels in an ocean liner called the Queen Elizabeth, goes to London and arrives at the end of December. She's met by a number of people there. And of course, is trying to get back herself to some sort of understanding of who she is as a person. But she's landing in England in the middle of the first wave of Caribbean migration, which is called that Windrush generation, which starts in 1948. and they have a lot of issues, housing, employment, all kinds of things. So because of that, and her skills already in place from the United States, she jumps right into a certain kind of activity, which allows her to work with that community and enhance their lives in many different ways. She does this through the formation of the first Black newspaper in England called the West Indian Gazette, which subsequently adds to it Afro-Asian Caribbean News. So it's the West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian Caribbean News, founded in 1958. She organizes then the first London Carnival, travels to Japan, the Soviet Union, and China between 1962 and 1964, and sadly dies in December 1964. Many people identify it as Christmas Day, the night, and as a result is interred to the left of Karl Marx's monument in Highgate Cemetery. If I can get a couple of those slides, it would show some of that information.
Do you guys see the screen?
Yeah, so can we go to the next one, please? So that's the copy of the cover of the book, Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones. And the title is significant, The Left of Karl Marx, because of the next item you'll see. Next slide, please. So this, if you go to Highgate Cemetery in London, the one before first, if you go to Highgate Cemetery in London, you will see the tall, massive bust of Karl Marx. This one you're looking at is a recently updated version. It was refurbished, and of course, recently, I'm sure if you followed the news, it was vandalized and so on. But there's a new entry point. If you look at the slide just before, can I see that one, please? Yeah, this is the one my daughter took. And I like this one because you get to see the scale of Marx, and that's flat stone to the left is where Claudia Jones's ashes is interred. You'd also see that every day at the foot of that bust, the pedestal, there people bring flowers and candles and all kinds of things. And often, they probably would not know that Claudia Jones, the famous, is buried to the left of Marx. This is where I got the title from. And simply because I was in a forum at Binghamton where somebody asked, is Claudia Jones buried next to Marx? And I said, she's actually buried to the left of Marx. And Sylvia Wynter, the famous theorist, said, wow, that's your title. So essentially, left of Marx is that coming from this actual positioning as one stands facing the Marx bust. But in my argument, as you know from those of you who read Left of Karl Marx, my argument is that Marx talks about how one can change the world, right? And he actually, this pedestal actually says that the philosophers have studied the world and so on. Now it's up to change. Now it's up to others to change it. And in my view, Claudia Jones became precisely that person who decides that she will take forward these teachings of Marx and then opens it up to include questions of race and gender and so on and so on. Somebody just said they also put flowers there too at her grave point. I'm happy about that. Thank you for doing that. So she's interred to the left of Marx at the monument in Highgate. Keep in mind, I've been challenged by a friend who says that why are we always talking about the fact that there's a flat stone, we should do something. So there's a plan afoot to create a bust that would go right there, and we will eventually start promoting it and advertising it in different ways. Okay. So if I can get the next slide, please. Yeah. Okay, the one if you can go back to the one before then. The next one. The next one. Right. So basically, two things happen. And in pointing out this second book, so The Left of Karl Marx is the book I did based on studying her life and experience as a Black woman, and I looked at a number of things. But subsequently, and I need to shout out Claudia Manchanda if she's on, she might just very well be. Claudia Manchanda is the daughter of Manchanda, who was Claudia's partner. And Claudia Manchanda was the one who wanted us to make sure that the work on Claudia it doesn't just stay in the sort of textbook, academic book kind of framing, but that is also available. And basically following the publication of Left of Karl Marx, we published Claudia Jones Beyond Containment, which includes her autobiographical reflections, and then a series of essays that she wrote on race and Black human rights, on women's rights, Black political prisoners, and the defense of Black activism, and the Caribbean diaspora. And then there are also 15 poems that she wrote, many of them while she herself was incarcerated, included in that collection. So I want to highly recommend this Claudia Jones Beyond Containment, because this is where, if you want to read some of the things that she wrote, you'll be able to get a copy of it. It's published by Banbury, IBEA, publishers in Banbury, England, but it's available in the US as well. If you go online, you'll find it. Okay. So can we go to the next slide, please? Right, the next one. I just wanted to go back to that. So essentially, right, this is it right here. So essentially, Claudia begins to be surveilled by the FBI, and the first major item in the file indicates just what you're reading there. Instant report contains a large amount of material from subjects' writings, which largely concern the equal rights of women as well as equality for Negroes. So this is what we're talking about, right? So this is what is criminalized in many ways. And in fact, once this piece of information, if one looks at the file, which is over 1,000 pages, you will find that generally the FBI director in New York particularly is saying, you all need to dig and find more stuff, because that can't be it right there. But what I want you all to get at is the fact that what we take for granted now, this whole idea of being able to do the kind of intellectual work that we do, and to study Black women, to raise the questions of equal rights for women and for Black people, is often identified as communist. And you will hear this repeatedly, even when the person is not, right? So people like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, would also be accused of communist. And Gerald Owen has a really nice discussion about this in some of his work, where he talks about the fact that this whole question of Black and red, that once you raise issues that have to do with Black people's advancement, it gets put automatically in the camp of being communistic. And one gets that all the time. You will also hear that in terms of some ways that people refer to Black Lives Matter movement as well. So this is the first piece from the FBI file that I wanted to share, okay? And then the next one, please. Okay, all right. So Claudia then begins to do a lot of activist work in the United States, as we said, and then goes to England. But one of the critical pieces that she wrote, so I'm switching now to talking a little bit more in depth about her work, her intellectual work around the question of activism and the question of radicalism, which was the title for this presentation, A Right to be Radical, right? So she writes a small pamphlet called Ben Davis, Fighter for Freedom. It's published by the National Committee to Defend Negro Leadership. It's a booklet that she writes about the right to have communist ideas. And at that point, keep in mind that Ben Davis was a councilman in Harlem, but he became one of a number of communist leaders, the first group of communist leaders who were arrested under the Smith Act. And some of the names she identifies in this Ben Davis Fighter for Freedom included Ben Davis and Henry Winston, Pettis Perry, of course herself, Claudia Jones, James Jackson, and a number of other names identified here. So basically she writes this pamphlet to defend Ben Davis, titled Ben Davis Fighter for Freedom, because Ben Davis was tried and incarcerated with that first group and had a number of appeals consistently, but eventually did time for, again, the same reason, for having communist ideas. I love to talk about this in one other way, in the fact that if you apply for US citizenship and you have to fill out a particular form, and I did that, at the end of that form, there are two questions which ask you, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? So within the construction of American citizenship, the idea of being a communist is identified outside of that. Just keep that in mind as well. So this is why whenever you hear this whole attack on some activism as being communistic, it's an attempt to locate one outside of the bounds then of what should be appropriately an intellectual position or political position. Okay, next one, please. So introduction. The introduction of the book is by Islander Gudrupson. And I point out importantly that there's a book on Islander Gudrupson by Barbara Ransby. And it's Islander Gudrupson was the wife of Paul Robeson. And she writes the introduction to this pamphlet that Claudia publishes. And Islander says, Claudia holds a position of leadership in the Communist Party and plays a major role in the work for equality for women and peace. For her beliefs, Claudia Jones was victimized by reaction and prosecuted under the Smith Act. She also faces deportation to her native West Indies under the Walter McCarran Act. Okay, so Islander writes the introduction. And she makes a couple other points. She talks about Ben Davies being her friend, talks about Claudia also being her friend, and that these are upstanding people, and she wanted to defend them. I wanted to rest on this importantly because many people know about Paul Robeson, but Islander is equally significant. In fact, she traveled to Africa, and there's work about that. And she's the kind of person who maintained an activist profile in the same time period, but does not get as much recognition as does Paul Robeson. Of course, he was a singer and quite popular and so on, an athlete and all of that, but she also did work. Okay, the next one, please. So, okay, so she talks about what in some of her work, and this comes largely from her piece on International Women's Day and the struggle for peace. She makes the point that Black people who are oppressed, the people who are oppressed in general, have a right to be radical. And what is she talking about being radical about? She wants to talk about being radical against, that we were radical against slavery. And in this Ben Davies Fighter for Freedom, she goes all the way back to Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, David Walker, and others, and comes forward all the way talking about the ways in which Black people have had to really resist these various forms of oppression. That you have a right to be radical then if you're living in an oppressive situation. And what is that radicalism going towards? In this particular piece, she talks about the need to have equal rights. She also talks about suffrage, the questions of voting, and then of course, socialism as well. She mentions that people have made great headway in the US on these, but these are still issues that she felt at that time was still to be addressed, okay? Next one, please. So she says, do not all people have a right to have radicals? Do not all people have the right to seek some radical solutions to their highly oppressed status and have a right to be radicals? It would seem they have, and have a right to be radical, she says, from Ben Davies, Fighter for Freedom. And I wanted to look at the fact that she says to have radicals, that we have a right to have people then who represent us in whatever way that we need them to, in an extreme way, in more radical ways than many people want to take on, but that we have a right to have radicals. We also have a right to seek radical solutions to oppressive situations. And we also have a right to be radical if we want to be. So this is her argument about radicalism and so on. And I think we can probably stop to talk a little bit about that because we can document and identify the whole idea of a Black radical presence, a Black radical tradition, which comes from, and I mean, people identify Cedric Robinson as naming it, but one can go back and look at many other intellectuals who raise similar kinds of arguments. People point to Du Bois, for example, Robin Kelly in particular, in terms of his saying that we're living a local phase of a global problem, and therefore we have a right to be involved in some sort of transformative project to challenge those oppressions. So kind of consciousness then, a knowledge of historical struggles for liberation and an obligation to advance these, not so? The way to reimagine emancipatory possibilities as well would be significantly there. And the idea is to be really fighting for a more humanistic world. And I think one of the points that is often made is that the question of Black radicalism often also includes an internationalist vision of Black freedom struggles, which challenge as well normative Western European rationality and its self-representation as equivalent with humanity in general. And this is a point that Sylvia Winter work really makes well. And then further, that within all of that, Black women have a right then to challenge these oppressive situations because of the nature of Black women's super exploitation. The Black women often are at the forefront of the work as well to question these things and to achieve a social order in which we all can flourish. And this is a point she makes in that essay, We Seek Full Equality, but also to a certain degree in an end to the neglect of the problems of the Negro woman. Because she's saying that once you look at the conditions of Black women and the Black women move, the rest of society moves anyway. And you can see this actually, not so? Just look at the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement and you will see basically this is precisely what happened in this case. That once Black women move, then the rest of society eventually moves then to where you are. Toni Morrison makes this point as well in her own work, where she talks about, you know, she stayed where she was and demanded that society, you know, come to where she was. So the question then of Black women, and I want to give another shout out to the Black women radicals for naming their group that as well. So radicalism, going to the root, of course, of something, searching thoroughly for complete social political change, not defined in the way that is, of course, by dominant culture, but in the ways that we want to do here, talking about a more humanistic world, a vision then that challenges Western European rationality. And this is what's going on, as I said earlier, in just casual conversation with on another thing, with the taking down of the statues, because essentially the whole question of the representation of the human comes as only legitimate if it's representing Western European man in positions of dominance. And so there's a sense then in which the logic of Western European man and his own sense of the world becomes normative and is made to be the one that we are supposed to accept as the given mode of being in the world. Okay, so in Ben Davis' Fighter for Freedom, she argues and describes many of those key themes that have to do with radicalism. She says then, I think it may be the next slide. Yeah, she says then the very core of all Negro history is radicalism against conformity to chattel slavery, radicalism against the betrayal of the demands of Reconstruction, radicalism in relation to non-acceptance of the status quo. This is from Ben Davis, Fighter for Freedom. What you're looking at is something that I got a great deal of excitement when I saw. I was doing research in the library at Northwestern University and came upon this image of a young Claudia in the Young Communist Review. And I think the cost of this, I can't see it on this slide, but the cost is something like 5 cents or something. You may be seeing it better than I am. But the Young Communist Review, and she's on the cover of it as a young woman. Okay, so she's talking about radicalism in that way. Can I go to the next one? I'm not sure what's there. Okay, and she goes on further. Is there any conflict between being radical and being loyal to one's country? She says then that history provides the best answers for this. The history of our people is rich in example that because the oppression of our people comes from the ruling class, the very survival of our people required non-conformity to preserve the dignity of manhood and womanhood. So the rest of that piece, while it's defending Ben Davis, is an argument for the right or the justification to really take on a radical position if you're living in a situation of inequality and if you're living in a situation where your oppression is viewed as normative or an assumption that the society wants you to be like that always. Okay, so she says, next one please. Yeah, we can conclude therefore as a result of these examples that the entire history of Negro people has been one of radical solution to the solely oppressed status. And she mentions here, as I pointed out earlier, Frederick Douglass, David Walker, and many of these who were assailed as radicals in their time. These were the and also she says, the staunchest fighters against slavery and Jim Crow for freedom and equality. Okay, so for her then, next one. Today, and this is all from that essay again that I'm trying to get you to look at, Ben Davis Fighting for Freedom, which was published as a pamphlet, and it's included in Claudia Jones Beyond Containment. So she ends by this whole point by saying, today the very meaning of any serious leadership in the fight for Negro rights brings one into opposition with the foreign and domestic policies of government, whether in writing, speeches, or needed organizational endeavors. Any Negro leader who pursues any necessary manifestation of leadership is labeled subversive and communistic. Okay? Leadership and radicalism. So I pointed out earlier that she was identified as, by the FBI then, as worthy then of being put under surveillance in 1947. And this is a direct piece from the FBI files, April 28, 1947, which identifies all of those things that I pointed out earlier about her, that she was a member of the National Committee of the CPUSA, Secretary of the Women's Commission, Negro Affairs Editor of the Daily Worker, one of the prominent younger leading communists, and therefore, in their view, was to be considered a top functionary of the Communist Party, therefore necessitating continuous active investigative attention to be given to the case. Okay, so that sums it up there. Now, I'm glad that you all mentioned Angela Davis earlier, because people identified Angela Davis as probably the only communist they knew coming through from that, in this period, from that earlier period. And Angela would make a similar point when she talks about the objective oppression of Black women in America has a class and also a national origin. So she wants there, in particularly, I like this piece for this quote for that particular reason, that it links quite distinctly with the arguments that people like Claudia had raised in defining woman, race, and class as a Communist Party position very early. So Angela Davis then is not to be seen only as a single unitary individual who just happened to become a communist, but actually part of a long line of women who were similarly active before her, along with her, and after her. So I think one of the key points that one has to make is that when people saw Angela Davis's Woman, Race, and Class, at least in my generation, the assumption was that she was sort of an aberration, that she was different, she was more radical, and so on. But actually, Angela Davis was carrying forward a whole pattern of activism, which she did not start, but which she became part of. So therefore, she was probably the most visible representation of that same tradition that Claudia Jones was part of earlier. And I tend to tell people, if you think of Angela Davis now, think back and then imagine that this was probably what Claudia would have been like back in that period in terms of her arguments, in terms of what she was doing, in terms of the captivating ways in which she was able to speak and lecture to community and so on. Everyone who I interviewed talked about her in that way, that she was captivating, that she could hold an audience for a long time, and that she had that kind of charisma and dynamism that one loved to see. And I wanted just to make that connecting point so that we understand what we're talking about here. Okay. And then really I wanted to give a close-up of that stone, valiant fighter against racism and imperialism, who dedicated her life to the progress of socialism and the liberation of her own Black people. And the rose is significant. A few years ago, I was giving a lecture in Leicester in England, and I was lamenting that every time I went to see Claudia and I would pass by and stop at the Marx bus, there would always be flowers. And somebody said, well, why not plant a rose for her? So I went to the florist shop down the street, not far from the Highgate Cemetery, on the road actually to the cemetery. And I bought this golden rose and I took it back there. And when I went back, this Highgate Cemetery had closed, but there was a gardener, and I told him, I said, can you please plant this rose for me at the gravesite of Claudia Jones? It's right to the left of Marx. And he said to me, well, I said, she's the person who founded the first London Carnival, which became Notting Hill Carnival. He said, well, if she did that, then she deserves this rose to be planted there. So that's why that rose is also there. And I'm really happy about that. So Claudia says in the end then, yes, to believe in Black freedom means to be radical, a right to be radical then. And I'll stop there. The last one is, I think, of her walking. Yeah, that's one of the times she's going to court in Foley Square. Great. So I think what we're going to do in the next period is to have a conversation, that's so, between Jaimee and I, and then questions from the audience moderated and so on.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Boyce Davies, for that amazing presentation. I was in the background on Twitter just citing you. So if you see a flood of tweets, it's me.
That would be nice.
And I'm really happy to speak with you, not only because of the Howard connection, but because of the amazing work that you've done on Claudia Jones. And I suggest everyone purchase Left of Karl Marx and Beyond Containment. Yes, please purchase these amazing books. And I really am excited to speak with you because I think we're at such a historical political juncture, what we're seeing right now in terms of the uprisings around the world because of police brutality, particularly of the police killing of George Floyd, and then also Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and others that we can name, unfortunately. But also COVID-19 has ravaged our communities, not just in the United States, but abroad in Brazil, where there's a large Black population. And so I wonder what we can take from Claudia Jones's radicalism at this point, and also too, what we can put in our repertoire and our political canons and our political thought and behavior. What can we take from Claudia Jones at this point in time?
Okay, a couple of things. One, her positions were always anti-imperialist and also pro-Black community. She would always want those three pieces to be together: women's rights, workers' rights, Black people's rights. But in a framework that was not just domestic US. And I think that whole question of being able to make the links with this, as you mentioned, Brazil, with similar patterns that take place globally is really significant. One of the things I liked about this current movement, and people were quite amazed that it erupted internationally, was the fact that people began to recognize this whole question of racism not just being domestic, but global. So people are like, how come people actually began to say things like they're marching in support of us in the United States? No, they were also marching, yes, but they were also marching because they recognized police brutality as a phenomenon that transcended the US space. And many people were able to show examples of the same thing happening in Palestine, happening in Mauritania, happening in many places around the world. And actually I saw footage of uprisings in Trinidad, where I'm from, for similar reasons, people being shot by police. Of course, there's crime, but the sort of automatic execution of Black subjects is what probably creates the tensions. And I love this whole idea that people assume that because of the pandemic, the idea was that people would be totally shut out and shut down. But the horrible, graphic, obvious murdering of George Floyd triggered something in people that allowed them not to really to self-sacrifice, to say that we're going to die, really, but we're not going to die quietly and let the state have its ability to destroy us like that. So that to me, that is the link with what happened. And particularly seeing the inequality particularly in New York. And I was really touched by the fact that more people died, more Caribbean people died in New York from COVID than died in the Caribbean. Think about what that means. So people had migrated here for a better life, so-called. And it's the same thing with Claudia. So she migrates with family and then realizes, as many people do, that they're in the middle of situations where they're either going to be super exploited, overworked, as her mother was and died because of speed up factory work, or then in this particular current situation to die from not being an essential, so-called essential worker, meaning you have to go to work, being in crowded subways and train situations, and then having to work in situations where you're constantly exposed to the virus that people could be self-quarantined about. So the inequality was too obvious, too viciously exposed. And I think this is the link that one can make with somebody like Claudia, coming from the Caribbean and then coming into Jim Crow, coming into oppression, and then seeing how the state teaches all of these values and then they're not really practicing it. So who are these values for? So when people like the president talks about the police are there to protect us, who is the us? It's not really Black people, because Black people have a totally different experience with police, all of us, right? So essentially Claudia then is somebody who lives that diasporic experience. She migrates to the US, but she does not stay apart from Black community in the United States. She actually works with and for. And that's the other thing I think we can carry with us as well, because often you have Caribbeans and Africans coming to the United States and actually acting as if their situations are totally separate from the struggles and experiences that people in the US encounter every day. And one has to abandon that, because what you know very well that we've had Africans like Amadou Diallo, who has been killed as well. And you have Abner Louima, the Haitian, who was brutally raped by the police, and so on. So basically, there's no way that the police is going to ask you, are you from Haiti, from Jamaica, when they stop you and then give you a pass because of that. So the question is how to, live in a world where we are able not to have that fear in encountering with somebody who's supposed to protect and serve you, right? I don't know if that, I went in a couple of different directions.
No, that was really perfect. Thank you for sharing that. And I really want to speak to, the site is called Black Men Radicals, and it was created in response to, I studied Black politics at Howard University. And I often at times, whether it's at a university or in community spaces, I didn't see Black women, gender nonconforming or non-binary people being taught about in Black politics and radical Black movement building, or just in social movement building in general. And so what you did with Left of Marx particularly, you really uncovered the Black female radical subject that is Claudia Jones, but amongst other people like Maud White and
Yes.
Louise Thompson Patterson, and you spoke about many different radical Black women. And so at this time, we can see throughout, whether they're historical or present, like we see Marielle Franco, what happened to her in Brazil and her leadership. We see Afro-Colombian women like Francia Marquez Mina, Assa Traoré in France. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the present and future possibilities of Black feminist radical leadership, because Claudia Jones always centered Black women, like as you said, in her politics, whether the Communist Party in the US and the Communist Party in London didn't accept it or not, she always centered it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, you've said a lot of nice things. So, many different directions. But I'm glad you mentioned all these women. There's one other one we need to really have more research on, and that's Grace Campbell, because she was the only woman who was head of the African Blood Brotherhood. And I remember listening to somebody just a while ago talking about the African Blood Brotherhood, which was again a Black left organization based in the US as well, which at one point I gather had about 7,000 members. But it was in defense of Black people, So we've had organizations which did not assume that we're just going to be beaten up and just sort of do the turn the other cheek kind of thing. But we've had organizations which said, no, if you come for us, we're going to be also coming back at you. And of course, you run the risk, of course, of the state coming down on you in a violent kind of way, but you have a choice, either be destroyed by them or just to be abused consistently and so on. So we've always had people then who have pushed against that boundary that the state wants to keep in place so that you become a compliant subject. Being a compliant subject means that you really say nothing, you accept abuse in your job, anything that can be done to you, you have to sort of turn the other cheek and leave it alone. And I think this is back to those statues again. The logic is that we are supposed to just accept and walk around cities and be pleased to see only white men in positions of dominance, that's all. And say nothing about that and not ask that there be a balance, at least, or the removal of those that are so offensive. And I think the one that was the most touching for me was the one in Bristol that they took down, was the slave merchant, and threw his statue in the water. I was quite pleased about that because I went to Bristol a few years ago and I went to the museum there, the Shad Museum, which I would recommend if you go to London, try to go to Bristol on the train, and it's about a 2-hour ride on the train. in that Shad Museum, it documents 1,200 slave ship voyages from Bristol, Bristol, England. 1,200 voyages of slaving that left from that port. The entire city is built then on the economics of slavery, right? So what do? Accept that, or be happy that he's in a position of dominance to be represented, or take him down? So I was pleased that your generation, again, is refusing to accept the assumption that one has to accept oppression and not do anything about it. I don't know if that answers any of what you said.
Yeah, no, it definitely, it does. And I also would like to just follow up and say, like, whereas Claudia Jones was erased and you uncovered her work, I also would like to know, like, your future thoughts on the future of, like, the Black feminist tradition.
Oh yeah, you did ask that. Yeah. Well, I think it's already happening, and you are good evidence of that. And the people from all over the world who have, I saw some people from Toronto, London, everywhere. I am really pleased that that has happened, that there's a kind of connection, fortunately, through the technology that we have at our disposal now. But these were connections that people were making anyway along the way. And I think it's really significant. I keep coming back to the fact that the Black Lives Matter trio, Patrice Cullor, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, that these are women from different geographic locations in terms of their heritage, and they come together in the United States, and we're able still to pull together and create a movement which has become internationalized. And so basically, again, I've been saying Black women lead. I have hashtag Black women lead. Whenever you see that, I've been pushing that out there, because I think, based on what Claudia says, once we move, other people will have to move. And therefore, this is why we have to not be afraid of taking positions and advancing them, but actually moving forward. And once we do, society also moves. If we accept, then nothing really changes, because then it's assumed that we're not going to want anything better, right? That we're happy to be serving always. No, we want to have a world that is not just one that makes us look good or feel better, but that everybody lives in a world that is fair and balanced, and one would have to live without fear and so on. So I think that's the kind of thing that Black women radicals are pushing. I am really pleased too that Black women radicals tend to not run just the question of gender, but as the Claudia Jones example shows, and you mentioned Marielle and others show, they're really concerned about the conditions of impoverishment in many communities. This is what Marielle was doing in Brazil, for which she lost her life. So the question of how to work through what happens to people in dire circumstances, people who are impoverished, people who are dealing with questions of oppression from the dominant society, and individual people who sometimes also act out those horrible ideas that come from the dominant society, and also finding ways to advance our lives and our families in more humanistic ways. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to end this because I could ask you questions all day, and thank you so much. And I know that we have tons of questions in the chat box.
There's so many of them.
So many. Yes. So thank you so much, Dr. Boyce Davies. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Jaimee. A pleasure meeting you.
Yes. Thank you.
All right. Hello back to you both. We can go ahead and move into the question and answers. For anyone who did not understand before, if you would like to ask a question, you can go ahead and type your question into the Q&A box, and from there we can see if we can ask both of them questions, or your question, excuse me. Okay, so the first question that we have is from an anonymous attendee. Tell us more of why Black and brown communist women are not centered in Marxist theory, and what are some ways we can bring them into our work?
This is one of the ways that we can bring them into our work. I definitely in teaching, well, I should say a couple of things, just backing up a little bit. When many of us did Black women studies, right, or Black feminist studies, Black women writers and so on, the linear narrative was the one that dominated. In other words, it went back to Sojourner and Harriet, and then it came forward all the way to the present. But we can see extensions, we can see a range of other people who should be part of that, not so? So one can talk about Chimamanda from Nigeria, right? One could talk about Jamaica Kincaid from the Caribbean, Edwidge Stanley, and so on in literature. In terms of looking at Black women's thinking at the intellectual level, the logic was also similar. That, in other words, it stayed primarily with questions of race and gender. Class was not really fundamentally always part of the discussion. It came in as an additive sometimes. And often when one is talking perhaps or using the work of Angela Davis, this is why I mentioned Angela is really significant always in any of these discussions, because she kept alive that piece, and therefore now one can see it tangibly operating in this contemporary context, right? So in other words, Sylvia Wynter has a point that I love to return to, that we in the academy are really responsible. We are responsible for either opening the doors so that people can have a wider body of knowledge, or closing it in so that people only get a narrow version of it. We have to always be ourselves informed. We have to extend ourselves and be able to read more and therefore add different portions of it. So the intellectual process, therefore, is one answer to that. That therefore the closing in of the study to only thinking about Black women in terms of race and gender alone limits the flow then, so that we tend to miss class. And therefore, somebody like Claudia becomes really fundamental in that discussion, because she is one of the people who really brings alive the question of those three pieces: workers' rights, women's rights, and Black people's rights. So I think it's the educational process. And then, of course, the US narrative, as I said earlier, which really wanted to keep any kind of logic. My argument in Left of Karl Marx was, by deporting Claudia, they deported the radical Black female subject to an elsewhere. And one can see it again with Anasata Shakur. One can see it with other people, therefore, who the state feels in many ways operated, or incarceration, that's it. The state feels in many ways is sort of excess, is not really representing what the state wants to define as its ideal normative subject or citizen, right? So the teaching practice and then the logic of the state, and then we have to push against that and move to a more advanced form of knowledge.
Excellent. Now moving into the next question, excuse me, it's from Adrian Ordonez. I'm curious, did Claudia ever address the debate of class versus identity?
Class versus identity? She talked, maybe you could, the essay is that end to the neglect of the problems of the Negro woman, because there you have both of those things taking place, that's so. So she's talking about class, but also identity. These are two different fields, that's so. Identity is a sort of a larger, broader spectrum in which one can have class identity, gender identity, sexual identity, and so on. And class identity sort of is one of those pieces that she definitely advances. Not so in a couple of her works. I don't know if I don't think the question is framed in a way to handle an opposition between class and identity, but to see identity as really a framework, and then different identities operating in that structure.
All right, so this question comes from Rachel. She says, thank you for sharing. Can Dr. Boyce Davies talk more about Kelso Cochran's death, considering she did organizing around his death? How can youth think more about transnational connections, given her own histories of being born in Trinidad and Tobago, raised and being an adult in the US, and sunsetted in England? How can we learn more about using joy through Carnival for Revolution? She coined triply oppressed years prior to adjacent terms.
How can we live that joy? But you know, she spent, this is a really cool thing about Claudia, and there have been a couple things, a play called A Rock and Water about that, which was put on at the Royal Court Theatre in London. And there's going to be a film actually made of this. I was contacted about that recently. For Claudia, culture, art is fundamental in any kind of societal structure. For her, this is why she used the logic of people's art as a genesis of their freedom. And you can see it. Somebody sent me images of the Confederate soldiers in Richmond and all around it there was graffiti and art. In other words, and if you look at where George Floyd was also killed, art erupted. Haitian artists created sculpture and so on. So people's art, she argues, is the genesis of their freedom. For Claudia, Carnival is that joy, is that taking space. And she wanted, in spite of the killing of Kelsey Cochran, in spite of the riots in Nottingham and Notting Hill, that there had to be a way that people understood that Caribbean people and Black people in general do not necessarily live a life of oppression only, but live a life of also joy. And I think that's what Carnival is, and that's what she felt she needed to advance. Now, there's a chapter about this in Left of Karl Marx. She spends quite a bit of time with colleagues who were communists who thought that this was frivolous, this was a waste of time, and the kind of logic of people say, well, Carnival, why are you wasting time doing that? But for her, the idea of a people's art being the genesis of their freedom is critical, because she wanted that space for us to be able to take space to challenge oppression. And Carnival is also, as I have written in my own work, both also conservative, it's radical, but it's also transformative. So there are portions of it that are very commercial, but the others that are not. So you have all of that in a mix, but essentially at its root, it's a liberation of people from the constraints of the dominant society, taking space in a cultural context which wants you only to work and exploit your labor and so on. And of course, sadly, it's generally limited to a very short period, 2 days often for the max in the diaspora, often 1 day. But what I love is that Caribbean people and Black people in general constantly push against those tendencies that want to really limit your ability to really be in the world as a full human being. In the end, that's what we want. We want to live as full human beings without the constraints, without police with their knees on our necks, and the ability to live freely and have a decent life.
In addition to Rachel's question,
Yeah.
what about Amy Ashwood Garvey?
Oh, yeah. Amy is really important. Thank you for raising that question about Amy Ashwood Garvey. She was Claudia's ride or die kind of person, because when Claudia wanted to start the West Indian Gazette, Amy funded it. But Amy was the kind who's traveled everywhere. She was a good friend or girlfriend, some say, of President Tubman of Liberia. So she would often be in Liberia, then she'd be back, but she was able to find ways and access to get resources. Amy Ashwood Garvey, of course, is the first wife of Marcus Garvey. And my students love when I go there because she was married to Garvey for 6 weeks or something. And then I can't tell you all the real story here, but if you take my classes, we could talk about it. but essentially, Amy Ashwood Garvey represented a kind of challenge to the ways in which the Garvey logic operated. She was the one who brought in the question of gender into the UNIA in a very deliberate way. She did a lot of the groundwork. She was one of the co-founders. And when she and Claudia interact in London, she's really fundamental to starting the West Indian Gazette in terms of funding it and that sort of thing. And a lot more about Amy Ashwood Garvey. But I always smile when I think about her, because she is reported to have taken a bottle of whiskey on their honeymoon when she and Garvey went on their honeymoon. But keep in mind, Garvey also took this woman who became the second wife, Amy Jakes Garvey. She was also on the same honeymoon as secretary. So as they called it, a working honeymoon. So it's like soap opera-ish, but we still respect the Honorable Mosiah Garvey, but clearly Amy Ashwood Garvey offered a different image, a different paradigm as far as Garvey is concerned. I love to have fun with that story though, without being iconoclastic.
Well, our next question comes from Joseph. What does the right to be radical mean?
Go ahead.
Does it mean that radical action is justified, or does it go beyond that?
Well, I think I wanted to just go back to one of the things I said, because I think that's one of the points that Claudia makes really well, that radicalism then is about what? It's a kind of knowledge of the history of liberation struggles, right? I'm going to repeat those, but it's also reimagining emancipatory possibilities, the imaginary then, that allows one to think of a better world. And the world that we live in is not the perfect one. We're always working towards that better world. And so being radical is a way then of going to the root of how does one create a better world. And it's not equivalent with being anarchist. It's not equivalent with being destructive, but it's equivalent with imagining. Those are just routes that people use or pathways that some people choose. But that's not the whole idea. Radicalism has to do then with imagining a better world. And for many people like Claudia, that better world included challenging the oppressed statuses of Black people, challenging the ways that she saw women still living lives of oppression, challenging the normative Western European rationality, and finding ways then to ameliorate those, to challenge them, to write against them, and so on. So the pathways are different, right? What one chooses to do is a different thing than the ideas. I want to stress that because, again, keep in mind, Claudia got in trouble with the US state because of ideas, but she was talking about how does one create a better world? How does one create a better society? How does one live a life to the fullest? And for her, socialism was that ideological frame. Communism was the organizational structure that she felt best able to carry those visions at that time. So this is Claudia in a very particular point in time. Radical means really going to the root of something to make it better. That's all it means. But then how one chooses to do that is a different question.
Excellent. So the next question comes from Judah. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Boyce Davies. My question is about the elegance of Claudia Jones.
Yeah.
I am interested in the context of radical self-care.
Oh, wow. I love it. You know, one of the things that touched me, and I kept showing photographs of her in my book for that reason, because often one saw her whenever she was out, and that last image we showed with her in the black dress was one of those, totally, completely put together and able then to, represent herself in the most elegant way. And I think one of the things that people say about that group of Black left communists that she was part of in New York at that time, in her time period, that they were kind of a radical chic, that the communist image or representation, self-representation was often one that tended to not necessarily be worried about how one looked, but that group of people that she was part of always self-presented. There was always a certain elegance in the way they carried themselves. And Claudia carried that all the way. And there are many stories of her in London going to have her hair done, doing all kinds of interesting kinds of self-presentation techniques. The problem with Claudia, I think that one should take away from this, though, the cautionary statement, is that she was also always suffering from a heart condition, but kept going all along and never really stopped. And I think that's the whole question of radical self-care that we have to get as probably the negative example from her. And that has to find a way to take care of self and not really reach the limit then in terms of one's health. Because people talked about the fact that in spite of being ill, she was always going still. She never stopped. And one has to really stop and breathe and take care of oneself as well and do that self-care. So that's one of the things I would say about her as well, that we can learn the other side from. And this is one of the things I like about your generation of activists, that the question of self-care is fundamental to it. It's fundamentally part of being an activist, that one should also always have radical self-care, which is also protecting oneself from oppressive people and staying away from a lot of negative, hateful people and negative energy. All of that is radical self-care.
Excellent. This next question is from Norma. Likely I missed it. Did she enumerate the need to end the profit system? No tolerance of capitalism. It can be said too often.
Yeah, there are many different essays. There's one that I chose to look at today had to do with something where she actually talked about radicalism. But one could find, and this is why I mentioned again this book, Claudia Jones, Beyond Containment, because there are many different essays where she talks about all of those questions and really goes into depth, into detail about how one may approach this question of challenging the way that the state works. She was a Marxist-Leninist. So most of her positions came from that point of view, and an assertion and an argument for how one may challenge the state's attention to buying military weaponry and so on, as opposed to feeding people. She spends quite a bit of time talking about that as well.
All right, next question is from Daniel Stein. I do not have my exact question that I submitted with the registration, but it is about how Ms. Jones developed the North London Carnival and how experiencing the joyous cultures of international solidarity can cut through and against the grief of suffering, but in terms of large civic events like Ms. Jones started, or with Mardi Gras here in New Orleans, or to empower any community to come outside in costume and celebrate some joy in the streets?
That doesn't sound like a question. It sounds like celebrating. But Claudia, just for the record, Claudia started the first carnival. It was indoors because it was February, and it was held, but it had all the elements of carnival. It had all the pieces that one would expect in carnival. And then at her passing, it went outdoors. So she gets credit for creating the first carnival, which then becomes Notting Hill Carnival. I want to make sure that's there. But my point too is that a carnival is never created by one person. It's created by a group of people. And that's the point I think that he is making. Carnival is community. Carnival is all kinds of things. It's the people who make the masks. It's the people who, do the music. It's a costume. It's everything. So carnival is a celebration that comes together for many different aspects of community. So you can't give her alone the credit, of course, but she, of course, spearheads that whole process, which is what we're talking about. So Mardi Gras, New Orleans, he mentions, I love that model because one finds, again, the Mardi Gras Indians do one thing, they do their thing, they show up in different places, in different locations, in their own communities in different ways, and they're not really part of that thing that one sees every year going down the streets with the beads and the breasts and all of that. So there are different things going on in the carnival. And I think that's an option, it seems, that is kept alive in that New Orleans example, which I don't know enough about to talk with authority. But I've done the Brazil carnival. I've been in the carnival in Brazil. And it's different. Rio Carnival is different from Salvador Bahia Carnival. So you have different manifestations of carnival. Trinidad Carnival is different too. So each one has its own peculiarity, its own difference, its own uniqueness, its own joy, its own everything, and how to tap into that spirit, which is actually revolutionary as well, to get that joy, but also to see how it allows community to take control of their own space and their own futures, I think is also important.
So given that Claudia was deported to the United Kingdom instead of Trinidad and Tobago, was radical thought able to take hold within the Caribbean itself? And this is from Phoebe Reinhardt.
Absolutely, because how should I answer that? Keep in mind, somebody like Stokely Carmichael comes from Trinidad and Tobago. He comes to Howard, of course, eventually as a student, and then does a lot of activist work in the US South. But there was a Black Power movement in the Caribbean as well at the same time. So we also had a number of union activities in the 1930s. So there's always been that undercurrent of activism in the Caribbean, which didn't really die. And I think this is the reason why they did not want her back in Trinidad at that time. And she ends up going to London. So, the whole question of her moving to London doesn't really cannot end activism in the Caribbean. It does not. In fact, you have all kinds of other things taking place. You have the Grenada Revolution, you have the work of Walter Rodney, you have all kinds of other activities taking place in the Caribbean as well. And definitely also a Black Power movement.
How did her family receive her activism? This is from Tanya Thames Taylor.
How did her family, Claudia's family?
Yes, how did her family interpret and receive her activism?
Okay. The one example I have in her book is her father, who was very supportive. And in fact, when she went to Allison and was incarcerated and then was coming home, she came home on the train with her father. And there are a couple of letters in her file written to him consistently. She had one other sister, I believe, alive at that time. I don't have a lot of information on the sister, but the father for sure. And really, what is really fascinating to me, a few years ago in Trinidad, we discovered some of her family members in Trinidad as well. And she was born in a small adjacent city to Port of Spain called Belmont, Trinidad. And we went down that street to her birthplace. It's right around the corner. It's called Casabon Lane. And we were able to go around that neighborhood and really see where she would have come from back then. But I met her family, her niece, a person who would be like a grandniece or something of that sort, who lives in Trinidad still. And they didn't know much about her, but they were quite happy to learn that this was a pathway in the end, in spite of the fact of her early demise, but the fact that she has been able to shape the world in such a dynamic way.
This is a very interesting question. Any advice for Black men looking to abolish the patriarchy as well as to build a safer community for Black women? And Black femmes, excuse me.
Just do that. Oh my God. You know, I work with some men sometimes who I think if you, in a situation where you observe a woman in a meeting, in a situation being talked to in a certain way, I think it's up to men who are around to say something about that to the other men and not just try to cover it up or say nothing about it. So I think men can end patriarchy by, it's just like how white supremacy functions and white people who are challenged to say something or do something about evident white supremacist actions in their presence. I think men have that same responsibility to do the same thing. I think we all do. If you see homophobic actions or listen to or in a group where that is taking place, then one has the responsibility to also say something about it as well. So I think men can organize, of course, and many have, but they can also be in the moment to really be there to challenge an oppressive situation that is unfolding in their presence. And say something, do something, you know, give us like shout out, like say, you know, nah, I'm not supporting that particular point that you're making. But often you don't have it, you know, you don't get it. So I want to say that that's one of the ways that I would see from my immediate experience of working with men who sometimes don't do that. And I'm calling them out. If they're listening, they will know that I'm talking about them right now. They know who they are.
I remember hearing that when Claudia Jones was deported from the US, she was held in a detention center with other socialist feminists, but I don't remember whom. Who was she in detention with? What interactions and work did Claudia Jones do with members of the Windrush generation? And how was that work pivotal in shaping Black identity and culture outside the Caribbean?
Wow, those are 3 questions. I don't know all of those details about that, who she was detained with. I really don't. I'm sure that's findable. And whoever, I keep saying that there's more work for y'all to do. What I did, and I'm hoping that there's another generation, and I'm beginning to see the signs of it, that are going to take this further and do more work and find out all these wonderful things. But I don't know that answer to that question. She was for a while though in that same New York City. She was detained for a little bit. There was a women's prison in Greenwich Village, and she was there, and talks about that in some of her own writing. Interestingly, Angela Davis was also there. That's where she was also detained at one point. Yeah, much later on. How does she help the Windrush generation? As I mentioned, when she goes to London, the Communist Party, Great Britain, and we talk about this in Left of Karl Marx, but the person who really writes about this the best is a historian named Marika Sherwood, who writes a book called Claudia Jones, A Life in Exile, which is based on a long conference which was held at the ICA in London, and which had people talking about that whole experience of her experience in London. Essentially, when she gets to London, having been at the center of US activity, CPUSA National Committee and so on, when she gets to London, she runs into British racism. Now, British racism is that other version that people forget about, but it's just as extreme as the US version. I'm not sure if you saw the fact that there was white nationalists who came out when Black people were protesting in England and actually wanted to attack them and so on. So, and actually when I interviewed Donald Hines in London, who worked for Claudia in the West Indian Gazette, he said they got letters from the KKK. So I was a KKK in England? Yeah. So essentially white nationalism operates in its international form as well. And that's why we should never apologize for taking positions that bring in our global conditions and the global conditions of people in other locations. So Windrush Generation, she's right at the center. She uses all of her skills to really find ways to ameliorate the conditions of Black people in London at that time. According to Donald Hines again, the office of the West Indian Gazette, and Ricky Cambridge, who worked there as well, was the kind of place that people could drop in and get help. And she would spend time trying to find ways that she could ameliorate the experiences of people who were going through difficulties and so on. She became a kind of godmother, according to Donald Hines, of the Black community in London, and also helped give shape to it in different ways. And keep in mind, Black community in London at that time, it's not just people of African descent, but also people of Asian descent as well, and a range of other people who were defined as, in the US context, as people of color, would be defined as Black people in the British context.
So the last question before handing it back over to Jaimee Swift deals with the two papers you wrote. This is from Ken Hurd. What are the names of those two papers?
The two papers I wrote?
Or was this for Jaimee? All right, so we'll have to answer that some other time, no problem. My mistake. So the last question, we can continue moving on. How do you explain the findings to someone who is fairly new, but yet open to becoming more radical in the way of thinking?
How do I explain the findings?
Yes.
What findings? I'm not sure.
How do you explain the ideas to someone who's fairly new, but yet open to becoming more radical in the way of thinking regarding radicalism?
Oh, okay. I would say definitely read and be, people say this, but it's not, there's no way around it. To be informed, you cannot talk about anything unless you have a good basis of knowledge that prepares you for engagement. So I would say definitely read and be informed. And a good place, of course, is to start with this book, Claudia Jones, Left of Karl Marx, is a good place because it covers so much ground. And then you choose from that what kind of organizations you can participate in or be part of. It's not a kind of thing that you could just do by yourself. So you need to find a particular kind of organization that allows you then to learn and develop and share your own talents, but then also learn from whatever is being offered. So read, prepare, and be organized, for sure.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Doctor. We'll go ahead and go back to Jaimee.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm back again.
Hey, Jaimee. I like that you wore a red scarf. I was going to do that.
Thank you. I need to get like you. I need to buy more scarves and just look like you. I mean, amazing. You've answered a lot of questions, so I know we're probably going to wrap up soon, but I really wanted to just ask you about Jones's super exploitation of Negro women, her articulation of that. And I wanted to get back to how you wrote in Left of Karl Marx, how in the beginning of her career, she had an editor steal her work. And also there was some concerns or issues around giving her credit for creating the Notting Hill Carnival, and how she faced super exploitation in terms of her intellectual productions as well. So do you mind speaking a little bit of that? And also, how have you dealt with that and overcoming that erasure as well?
It's not easy. Well, the super exploitation thesis, just briefly, maybe important just to summarize that a little bit. But the easiest thing I tell people, this explained, and for me, this explained why Black women are always so overworked and so underpaid and so tired. That's all it is. So for her, super exploitation, she's arguing that just as the labor of workers is exploited, then there are other laborers, the fractions of those same working communities, which also exploit Black women. And therefore, they're not remunerated anywhere at the level to which is equivalent with what they give out in terms of labor, in terms of work. So super exploitation, first, she's using a Marxist concept of super exploitation, the way that labor is expropriated and then used, but then adding to it the ways in which women, Black women in particular, give much more work than they're paid for, whether it's in the home, whether it's in the job situation and so on. And this explains why our mothers or grandmothers work so hard and you see them really about to drop, but you know, they still keep going because they're giving so much work, whether it's family or community and so on. And then, there's so many examples. So basically for her, and I developed more in the book, of course, but basically the shorthand is that Black women's labor is super exploited, is multiply exploited in a way that is way beyond the exploitation of laborers in general, period, by dominant society in the way that society is organized. So that's what she's arguing, and that's one of the points that she contributes to thinking, about Black women's experience. And your second point, I forgot.
It was in terms of the super.
Oh, my own experience.
Of your experience, and also how there was a contention back and forth of who kind of started the carnival, and they didn't want.
Oh yeah. Right. The credit was going to be given to a woman who was a social worker in a neighborhood named Ramlazet. And because she was the one in the end who created a few movements where people began to go out of the street to parade it as part of like a summer camp situation. But Claudia was the one who actually began the logic of having a carnival. So taking away that from her, to me, is also, she had the idea of having a carnival. And according to Colin Channer, the idea was that the carnival was going to go outside anyway, right? I made a mistake with the name, but I forgot the last name. But essentially, the idea was that the carnival was going to go outdoors in any case. And the idea was that it was started in February. So she started the first carnival. People had on costumes in the trains. They had steel band. They had all of the pieces of carnival. But it was indoors. But this is not unlike, like DC, for example. When I went to Howard, they used to be like Caribbean Students Association, had a carnival indoors. And eventually it went outdoors. And eventually became a big DC carnival, which I heard doesn't happen anymore. but many of the others started like that, whether it's Toronto, whether it's wherever. It's generally begins with a kind of indoor kind of thing and then becomes a larger, it explodes outside of the population. So to me, there's not an argument at all. And as I said earlier, you can't just say only Claudia started the carnival, but you can say that she used the West Indian Gazette to have the first London carnival. And that she has to be given credit for that. In my own experience, I think all Black women would probably say that at some point you realize, and this often happens in terms of how much you get paid sometimes. Like when I got my first position at Binghamton, I was going I had a 2-year-old, 3-year-old child, and the salary that I was offered, I didn't even negotiate it. I just was like, oh, that's the salary, thank you. And then when I got there, I realized I was so underpaid for years. I was underpaid. So, and in fact, another woman who was hired around the same time that I was hired got a salary that was $10,000 more, white woman, and I didn't even know that you could negotiate. So I think you start off from a period of not really knowing what you're worth, and then gradually you find yourself pushing against the boundaries. And this happens at every level, every single level. So when I keep telling people that whenever you feel you got too much, you really didn't get all at all. Because sometimes later on you find out that what you thought was quite a lot was still smaller than what many other people had at the same time. So we are all victims of that, but we also have to be smart and find ways to challenge it.
Definitely. Yeah. I know, and I don't feel bad because we've been talking so much. I'm like,
drinking Prosecco then.
Oh, yes, I love it. I'm a lightweight. I was
going to get water, but I had this Prosecco, so I'm like, why not?
I love it. I would have been passed out if I was drinking anything talking to you right now, lightweight, but cheers, yes.
Prosecco is very light. It's not really strong.
I love it. I love it. I would also
I also have water there.
I would also like to ask, you write that Claudia Jones would articulate herself or describe herself as a journalist, and that her activism was through writing. And so what I loved about what you wrote about Claudia was the WIG, the West Indian Gazette, and it ended up going to the Afro-Asian Caribbean News, which it expanded, like, once again, her internationalist framework. And so, and also she was wrote half of the World, and amongst other things, I wrote for the Daily Worker. So in your estimation, what is the role of a radical Black journalist? Because you can see now, you know, with Fox News and CNN and amongst other things, there's gatekeepers, right, to this.
Right. You know what I love? Ida B. Wells is the model.
Mm-hmm.
Ida B. Wells was a journalist, but she fought back. She filed a lawsuit against them, throwing her off a train. She organized people to move from her community. And my class recently read her and they were like blown away just before Ida B. Wells got that major Pulitzer Award posthumously. So they were happy that they already knew who she was. So I think the model is actually Ida B. Wells. So Claudia does a version of that for sure. But the idea is using one's journalistic skill, as Ida B. Wells does. She writes about lynching. She writes the Red Record. She documents the fact that lynching was not about Black men just desiring white women, but that it was economic reasons, you know, and we have examples from Tulsa and so on. So using one's journalistic skills then to represent, and this is a radical Black woman for sure, to represent one's community and challenge the way, again, the society decides to position one's community, and to find ways then through those means. And as I said before, there are different means, right? Radicalism doesn't mean that everybody's going to blow up a building or pull down the horse or whatever, pull down the statue. But many people do different things. So radicalism has to do with challenging the way that society operates and finding a way then that one is able to use those skills to challenge those oppressive structures. And she does that with journalism, and repeatedly so. And I was quite impressed about that. She, in fact, in her passport, she was identified, the person wrote typist. There's a line drawn through it in her handwriting, and it says journalist. That was her profession consistently throughout her life. So journalism for sure for Claudia. It's a different thing now, isn't it? Because now people have access to social media and so on. So one can do all kinds of communications via social media, and it takes journalism in a different direction. And I was quite like, for example, when Jaimee Alcindor was treated as horribly as she was by the president, one saw, and also the woman before, I forgot her name, one saw a kind of really horrible pattern of the Black woman being treated in a certain way. But then you realize it wasn't just Jaimee, it was other women, it's everybody else. And then it became that whole pattern of, if you don't pay attention to what happens to Black people or Black women or people of color, then you see the same thing happen in the dominant culture. It ends up to Ed Acosta. So April Ryan was the first one that he really spent a lot of time abusing. And the press corps would do, the press secretary then would do the same thing. So what happens to Black women journalists, I think in the public eye, and the way that they write or challenge dominant systems is a range, appears in a range of possibilities. And they choose how they're going to do it.
Definitely. And this is my last question for you, because I know you're chilling over there with your wine, but I do want to be cognizant of how long you've been speaking. But I want to promote another book you wrote, because I love this book. It's called Black Women Writing and Identity. And what I love about your work is that you, like you said, Ida B. Wells was a blueprint for Claudia Jones, and you said Claudia Jones was a blueprint for Angela Davis, going back to these like iterations of Black feminist thought. And so Claudia Jones is in this long tradition of that. So my last question would be, why is it important to interrogate different Black feminisms as blueprints to, I would say, Black liberation?
I don't know if blueprint is the best word, but maybe we can say guides, right? guides, maybe. Blueprint seems to suggest you're going to follow them exactly, because the blueprint, you build a house, you got to have a blueprint. I think as guides for how one can move in the world. And they appear in different locations. You mentioned that first book, and the idea was to break up the idea that Black women are living only in the United States and writing only in the United States, when you have Black women everywhere in the world writing. And I learned this, this was on the ground experience for me going to Brazil the first time, when I was looking for Black women of Brazil, and everywhere I would go, they would tell me, I think I have discussed this in that Migrations of the Subject book. Everywhere I'd go, they would bring me Toni Morrison, be like, no, I want to know Brazilian women writers, Black Brazilian women writers, Black women writers here. And they were like, oh no, we don't have any, until I met the writers, right? So essentially Black women write from their different experiences in multiple locations around the world. And it's a joy to see that field of Black women's writing internationally now so evolved and so developed. So that Chimamanda, when we were doing the first works that talk about African women writers, Amata Idu from Ghana was somebody that one barely heard about, but one spent time trying to uncover her work and find ways to talk about her and so on. One only heard about Chinua Achebe, right? But then you learn gradually that there are a range of other writers writing in different locations. So Black British women, really another important piece that one should study and try to understand and find. And to me, if one is teaching a class in any kind of British literature that has to do with teaching the white versions of things, one can easily include, or anything that has to do with imperialism and writing, one could easily include some of those works as well as a kind of counter text. Another important person I need to mention, Beryl Gilroy, who was the mother of Paul Gilroy, and one never really hears much about her, but when I did my research in London, she was actually more known and more respected than was Paul. Paul Gilroy was more respected once he came into the US market here. But Beryl Gilroy was a writer, a school teacher, wrote autobiography, Black teacher, many novels, well-respected, a psychologist, and all of those really wonderful things. So Black women's writing, to me, explodes in different locations, and we celebrate all of them as we find them.
Perfect response. I'm so glad you mentioned Miss Beryl Gilroy, because I think they're trying to put a statue of her up. She's was the first Black school teacher. They're trying to erect a statue of her instead of having a racist statue.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That's good to know.
Yes.
Yeah. And you know what she told me? I used to spend a lot of time with her, and she would write me these really little letters, cute letters. She said when she first went to teach in England, all of the children ran under the desks and hid because they'd never seen a Black person before.
Wow.
Teacher. And they were all hiding under the desks. And she said she went to the blackboard instead and started drawing things. So she drew an elephant with a cat face or something like that. And then she said they would start poking out from under the desk, and they would tell her things like, that's not right. And she said, well, come on and show me what the correct thing is. And then they would come out one by one. So she was doing all kinds of things like that to get them to come out. And eventually she became a really popular teacher. So that Black teacher is really significant. She also has a really important book called Stedman and Joanna about a biracial woman in the time of slavery who was a courtesan and so on. And she also had another book that she was working on when she passed.
Wow. Well, just so flabbergasted that I get to speak with Dr. Carole Boyce Davies. Once again, I want to say thank you so much for just everything and the amazing presentation. It's been quite an honor. And I'm going to bring it back to Jordan. And I also want to shout out Dante and the Claudia Jones School and just in general for just putting this together. Thank you so much, Dr. Boyce Davies.
Thank you, Jaimee. I'm glad to meet you. We're going to meet in real, right?
Yes, I would love that. Thank you so much. And you have to sign my book.
All right, well, thank you to everyone on this call that was able to join us this evening. We just want to give a few announcements before we close. The Claudia Jones School has 2 upcoming events, with one being this upcoming Monday, July 6th from 6 to 9 p.m., where we will be hosting organizers from the DC Poor People's Campaign, local tenants unions, and workers' centers about the unemployment crisis. Our second event will be on July 14th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m., featuring historian Dr. Gerald Horn, who will be
Oh, wow.
connecting the history of communist organizing in the US and the global uprising we are currently experiencing around the world. We also want to give a sincere thank you to both Dr. Boyce Davies and Jaimee for joining us for this beautiful, uplifting ceremony, uplifting Claudia Jones. Oh my God, I'm sorry. Uplifting Claudia Jones' name and lifelong work. And I hope everyone will be able to grab a copy of Dr. Boyce's 2 books on Claudia Jones, and to also check out the work that Black Women Radicals is currently doing. Would you, Dr. Boyce Davies, or Jaimee like to say any closing words before we end tonight?
I want to thank you. I'm so proud of you all again. And this was supposed to be an actual visit. Then I got emails that said, can we do this online? And as you know, many of us are asked to do all kinds of things now via Zoom because we're all captive and so on. But I'm hoping that we live in a world where we are able to engage each other as human beings, in the flesh, and be able to talk and meet in person. But while we have the ability to communicate by these means, we also thank you. And I want to thank the Claudia Jones School for Political Education for actually keeping Claudia Jones's name alive in this way. She would be ecstatic. She'll be so happy. And I want to thank Jaimee Swift and the Black Women Radicals for actually having an organization that is named for Black Women Radicals. Can I join? Is it possible to join that organization?
Oh my gosh. You can join anytime, yes.
Okay.
We're the top Black Women Radicals. So
all right. I'm going to join. And tell everybody else they should join.
Thank you so much. What do I have to say? I just would like to say to, like I said, Dante, Jordan, Rob, Dr. Carole Boyce Davies, thank you so much for joining in this call. And yes, please support Black Women Radicals, whether it's just reading a post about Burl Gilroy last week, but just reading a post and to just keep reading about Black Women Radicals and gender nonconforming radicals, because we are here and always have been. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jordan.
Absolutely. No problem. And
a toast.
I would.
Coffee.
To everyone watching, including you, Dr. Davies and Jaimee, and the Claudia Jones School, everyone have a good night.